For millions of Americans today, life feels more expensive, more fragile, and more exhausting than it used to. Not because people suddenly forgot how to work hard, plan ahead, or be responsible, but because the economic rules governing everyday life have quietly changed. This is not a story about individual failure. It is not about poor budgeting, bad choices, or lack of discipline. It is about a system where the cost of survival recesses faster than the ability to keep up, where stability has been replaced by constant exposure to risk, and where effort no longer guarantees security. The cost of living is often explained as inflation, as if it were a temporary disturbance that will eventually pass, but what Americans are experiencing goes deeper than that. Housing no longer functions as shelter. Healthcare no longer prioritizes health. Debt no longer enables mobility. Work no longer reliably leads to a better life. What appears on the surface as a series of separate problems is, in reality, a single structure, one that concentrates power, shifts risk downward, and normalizes insecurity as the price of participation. This is a story about how modern American life was redesigned, quietly, incrementally, without consent. And once you see that design clearly, the struggle so many people feel every day stops looking like coincidence and starts looking inevitable. For years, Americans have been offered a simple explanation for why life keeps getting more expensive. Prices are rising because of inflation. Inflation is framed as a temporary disturbance, a consequence of global disruptions, supply chain breakdowns, and energy shocks. It is presented as something impersonal and unavoidable, almost like a natural force that will eventually correct itself. But the reality Americans are living through today no longer fits that story. What we are experiencing is not primarily inflation. It is the concentration of price-setting power. Inflation implies that prices rise because underlying costs rise. But in today's U.S. economy, prices are increasingly rising because corporations have the ability to raise them without fear of losing customers. This shift matters because it changes the nature of the crisis. It is no longer cyclical. It is structural across essential sectors of daily life. Pricing power has moved away from competitive markets and toward consolidated corporate control. Housing, food, healthcare, insurance, and utilities are no longer shaped by many small actors responding to local conditions. They are increasingly governed by large firms with national reach, standardized pricing strategies, and the confidence that consumers have limited alternatives. Housing reveals this most clearly. Rent has not surged because landlords suddenly faced dramatic increases in operating costs. Property taxes did not double nationwide. Maintenance expenses did not spike uniformly across cities. What changed was ownership structure. Large corporate landlords and investment firms have steadily absorbed rental housing, replacing individual owners with algorithm-driven pricing models. Rents are set by software that tracks what the market can tolerate, not by what tenants can afford. When one major player raises prices, others follow. Not out of necessity, but because coordination through shared data removes competitive restraint. For renters, moving is costly, supply is constrained, and wages lag behind. The result is predictable. Prices rise, resistance disappears, and the increase becomes permanent. The same dynamic appears in food pricing. A small number of corporations control the majority of food production and distribution in the United States. When prices increase, consumers cannot meaningfully opt out. Eating is not discretionary. Even when supply chains stabilize and input costs ease, prices rarely return to previous levels. Once consumers demonstrate they can absorb higher costs, those prices become the new baseline. This is not inflation adjusting to equilibrium. It is price anchoring backed by market dominance. Healthcare operates under an even more extreme version of this logic. Medical costs are not high because care has become proportionally better or more complex. They are high because pricing is deliberately opaque and structurally disconnected from consumer choice. Insurance companies, hospital networks, and pharmaceutical firms negotiate prices far removed from patients, who are required to pay regardless of transparency or alternatives. Illness eliminates choice. Urgency overrides comparison. This is captive demand, and captive demand allows prices to rise independent of inflationary pressure. This is why official inflation metrics increasingly feel disconnected from lived experience. Even when inflation rates slow, rents remain elevated, premiums continue to climb, and grocery bills stay high. The cooling of inflation does not reverse prices because inflation was never the primary driver. Market power was once. Prices rise under conditions of consolidation. There is no mechanism forcing them back down. Public discourse continues to focus on inflation because it is politically convenient. Inflation feels abstract. It avoids naming winners. It frames hardship as collective misfortune rather than the outcome of structural decisions. But when prices rise while corporate profits remain strong, when costs stabilize but consumer prices do not, and when alternatives vanish year after year, the explanation becomes unavoidable. This is not a temporary spike caused by economic overheating. It is a system where survival expenses are controlled by entities large enough to absorb public outrage and shielded by regulatory complexity and lobbying power. Price increases persist not because they must, but because they can. The modern cost of living crisis is built on this foundation, a shift from markets that respond to pressure to systems that eliminate it, from prices shaped by necessity to prices shaped by confidence. Confidence that Americans will continue to pay because for essentials, they have no choice. Before discussing wages, debt, or financial survival, this reality must be understood clearly. The cost of living did not rise because inflation ran out of control. It rose because economic power consolidated, and once it did, prices followed. In the United States today, living paycheck to paycheck has become so common that it is often treated as a personal failure, a budgeting issue, a discipline problem, a matter of poor financial choices. But this framing is deeply misleading, because it assumes that financial breathing room still exists and that people are simply failing to use it wisely. For most American workers, there is no breathing room left to manage. Living paycheck to paycheck is no longer a reflection of insufficient effort or inadequate planning. It is the outcome of a cost structure that has systematically erased financial margin from everyday life. A system where income arrives already spoken for, allocated in advance to obligations that cannot be postponed, reduced, or negotiated. Rent consumes a fixed portion of income before anything else is considered. Health insurance premiums are deducted regardless of usage. Utilities fluctuate without warning. Transportation costs are mandatory for employment. Debt payments are non-negotiable. By the time a paycheck reaches a worker's account, most of it has already been claimed. What remains is not disposable income. It is residue. This is the core reality of modern American life. Expenses are structured to leave households operating at near zero balance by design. The system does not fail because people cannot save. It fails because saving has been engineered out of reach. Financial margin used to serve a purpose. It allowed households to absorb shocks, a medical bill, a car repair, a temporary loss of income. Today, that buffer has disappeared. Instead, millions of Americans live in a state of permanent financial preclusion, where stability exists only as long as nothing goes wrong. And something always goes wrong. A single unexpected expense is enough to trigger a cascade. Credit cards fill the gap. Buy dash now, dash pay, dash later plans step in. Short-term debt becomes the temporary solution that quietly turns permanent. What appears as financial flexibility is actually delayed collapse, stretched across monthly payments and interest rates. This condition is often described as fragility, but it is more accurately understood as exposure. Exposure to risk without protection. Exposure to volatility without margin. Exposure to crises without recovery time. Crucially, this exposure is not accidental. The modern cost structure of American life assumes continuous income with no interruption. Miss one paycheck, and the system immediately punishes you. Fees accumulate. Late payments compound. Insurance coverage lapses. Housing security weakens. The system is calibrated not to forgive disruption, but to amplify it. This is why so many working Americans feel constantly anxious even when employed. Employment no longer provides safety. It merely delays catastrophe. Stability has been replaced by conditional survival. Public narratives often insist that higher wages alone would fix this problem. But wage increases that fail to outpace fixed costs do not restore margin. When rent, healthcare, insurance, and utilities rise in tandem with income, the space to breathe never reappears. The structure remains intact. Only the numbers change. Paycheck to paycheck living persists, not because workers are underpaid in isolation, but because life has been priced in a way that captures every dollar of income before resilience can form. In this system, households are not expected to build savings. They are expected to remain liquid just enough to keep consuming, just enough to keep paying, and just enough to stay employed. Financial exhaustion becomes a stable equilibrium, and this equilibrium serves a purpose. A population without margin is a population that cannot pause, cannot strike, cannot relocate easily, cannot take risks. Financial pressure ensures compliance, predictability, and continuity of labor. The absence of a buffer is not an oversight. It is functional. This is why living paycheck to paycheck has become normalized rather than treated as an emergency. It is no longer seen as a crisis state, but as the default condition of working life. A condition people are taught to adapt to rather than escape. The danger of this system is not just economic, it is psychological. Constant financial exposure produces chronic stress, decision fatigue, and a narrowing of future planning. When survival consumes attention, long-term thinking disappears. People stop planning for progress and start managing decline. Understanding this matters because it reframes responsibility. The question is no longer why Americans failed to save. The question is why the system no longer allows it. Paycheck to paycheck living is not evidence of individual weakness. It is proof that modern American life has been designed without margin, and that design is working exactly as intended. For most of American history, housing served a clear social function. A home was a place to live, to build stability, to anchor family life and community. It was tied, however imperfectly, to local wages, local employment, and local conditions. If people worked, saved, and stayed employed, housing was difficult but achievable. That relationship no longer exists. In today's United States, housing has largely stopped functioning as shelter. It has been transformed into a financial asset class optimized not for human stability, but for return on investment. Homes are no longer primarily built, bought, or held to be lived in. They are held to be leveraged, traded, bundled, and monetized. This shift did not happen by accident. It happened because global capital needed somewhere to go. As financial markets searched for yield, housing became attractive, not because people needed homes, they always have, but because shelter is a guaranteed demand. People can delay consumption of many things. They cannot delay the need for a place to live. That makes housing uniquely valuable as a revenue stream. Corporate landlords, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, and institutional investors entered the market at scale. They did not buy homes one at a time. They bought in bulk. Entire neighborhoods, entire portfolios, single-family homes, apartments, and rental complexes were absorbed into balance sheets. Once housing is owned this way, its purpose changes. Prices are no longer anchored to what local residents earn. Rents are no longer adjusted based on community affordability. Instead, housing prices are benchmarked against global return targets, investor expectations, and quarterly performance metrics. A renter's paycheck becomes irrelevant to the pricing equation. This is why housing costs feel disconnected from reality. In many American cities, rents rise faster than wages year after year, even when population growth slows and local economic conditions weaken. Under a traditional housing market, this would trigger a correction. Under financialized housing, it does not. Investors are not responding to local signals. They are responding to portfolio strategy. If a market underperforms, rents are raised to compensate. If vacancy increases, incentives are reduced, not prices. If tenants struggle, turnover is absorbed as a cost of doing business. Losses in one city are offset by gains in another. The human consequences are externalized. For individuals, this creates a brutal mismatch. People are told that housing is expensive because they did not work hard enough, save early enough, or choose the right career. But no amount of individual effort can compete with institutional capital that can buy homes with cash, absorb losses, and wait out cycles. Hard work does not outbid hedge funds. This is why traditional advice no longer applies. Saving diligently, building credit, and advancing professionally no longer guarantee access to stable housing. The ladder itself has been removed. What remains is a wall priced according to global demand, not local ability. Renting, once framed as a temporary stage before ownership, becomes permanent. Ownership, once a milestone of adulthood, becomes inaccessible without inheritance, family wealth, or prior asset exposure. Housing stops being a pathway to stability and becomes a gatekeeping mechanism. Even those who already own homes are not insulated. Rising property values are celebrated publicly, but privately they translate into higher taxes, higher insurance premiums, and higher maintenance costs. Housing appreciation benefits asset holders in theory, but increases living costs in practice. The system extracts value from everyone, owners and renters alike. What makes this transformation especially dangerous is how normalized it has become. Housing shortages are discussed as supply issues, zoning problems, or lifestyle preferences. Rarely are they acknowledged as the outcome of financialization. Rarely is the question asked, who owns the housing and for what purpose? Once shelter becomes an asset class, displacement becomes routine. Communities fracture. Long-term residents are priced out. Workers are forced farther from jobs. Commutes lengthen. Quality of life erodes. These are not unintended consequences. They are collateral damage. The core truth is simple but uncomfortable. Housing in America is no longer priced for living. It is priced for return. And in a system where homes exist primarily to generate profit, access to shelter is no longer a function of contribution or effort. It is a function of capital positioning. This is why working harder no longer brings people closer to stability. This is why housing insecurity resurfaces even as construction continues. This is why affordability feels permanently out of reach. Because shelter has been transformed from a social necessity into a financial instrument, and once that happens, human need is no longer the priority. The decline of the American middle class is often imagined as a sudden collapse. Factories closing, mass layoffs, entire communities falling into visible poverty. But that is not how it is happening. The middle class is not collapsing dramatically. It is eroding quietly, steadily, and largely out of sight. From the outside, many middle-class households still appear stable. They are employed, they own cars, they may even own homes. Their lives resemble normalcy. This outward appearance creates the impression that the middle class remains intact, that economic anxiety is exaggerated, and that the system is still working for those who did everything right. But beneath that surface, the foundation is hollow. The modern middle class is defined less by security and more by exposure. Income continues to arrive, but it arrives just in time. Assets exist, but they are illiquid and leveraged. Stability depends on uninterrupted employment, stable interest rates, and good health conditions that no individual can fully control. What has changed is not how the middle class lives, but how close it is to collapse. A single job loss is often enough to destabilize an entire household. Emergency savings are thin or non-existent. Health insurance is tied to employment. Mortgage payments, car loans, and credit obligations continue regardless of income disruption. What once would have been a temporary setback becomes an existential threat. Medical events are especially destructive. A serious illness does not just affect health, it dismantles financial security. Even insured families face deductibles, uncovered treatments, and lost wages. Medical debt becomes the fastest pathway out of the middle class, not because of irresponsibility, but because the system offers no meaningful protection from high-impact risk. Interest rate increases reveal another layer of fragility. Rising rates are often discussed in abstract macroeconomic terms, but for middle-class households, they translate directly into higher monthly payments. Mortgages reset, Credit card balances become heavier. Auto loans stretch further into the future. The cost of maintaining the same life quietly rises while income remains flat. Debt in the United States is often framed as opportunity. Student loans are described as investments in the future. Credit cards are marketed as convenience. Medical debt is treated as an unfortunate but temporary burden. In public discourse, debt is positioned as a bridge, something that helps people move forward. In practice, it functions very differently. Modern American debt is not designed to enable mobility. It is designed to anchor people in place. It shapes behavior, limits choice, and enforces compliance long after the original transaction is forgotten. Student loans are the clearest example. Higher education is sold as the gateway to stability, yet it increasingly begins with decades of obligation. Graduates enter the workforce already constrained, not by lack of ambition, but by monthly payments that cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. This debt narrows life options. Career choices are filtered through repayment schedules, risk-taking becomes irresponsible. Public service, entrepreneurship, and creative work are quietly ruled out. Medical debt operates with even less consent. Illness is not optional, and neither is treatment. Bills accumulate quickly, often without clear pricing or understanding. Once incurred, medical debt follows people for years, damaging credit, raising borrowing costs, and limiting access to housing and employment. Health events become financial sentences, not because care was luxurious, but because survival was expensive. Consumer debt completes the system. Credit cards, buy Dash Now, Dash Pay, Dash Later plans, and personal loans fill the gaps left by stagnant wages and rising costs. They allow people to smooth consumption temporarily, but at the cost of long-term dependency. Minimum payments extend balances indefinitely. Interest compounds quietly. What appears as flexibility becomes permanent obligation. Together, these forms of debt create a condition of managed precarity. People with significant debt are less likely to leave bad jobs. They are less able to challenge employers, negotiate wages, or tolerate gaps in income. Quitting becomes dangerous. Striking becomes impossible. Relocating becomes risky. Debt turns employment into a requirement for survival rather than a platform for growth. This is not accidental. A workforce constrained by debt is predictable. It shows up. It complies. It absorbs pressure. Financial obligation enforces discipline more effectively than coercion. People do not need to be forced to work harder when missing a paycheck threatens their housing, credit, or health care. Debt also reshapes psychology. Long-term obligation produces anxiety, caution, and short-term thinking. The future becomes something to manage rather than build. People delay families, postpone healthcare, and abandon long-term goals in favor of immediate financial survival. Life choices shrink to fit repayment schedules. Public narratives continue to frame debt as a personal responsibility issue. Borrow wisely, budget better, plan ahead. But this ignores the structural reality that debt has replaced public investment. Education, healthcare, and basic stability are increasingly financed by individuals rather than institutions. Debt fills the gap where collective support once existed. In this context, default is not failure. It is resistance that the system cannot tolerate. That is why penalties are severe, forgiveness is rare, and relief is slow. Debt must remain enforceable to maintain its function. The result is a society where financial freedom is conditional. People are not rewarded for productivity alone. They are constrained by obligation. Advancement becomes secondary to maintenance. Growth is postponed indefinitely. Debt in America does not primarily exist to help people move forward. It exists to keep them moving continuously, predictably, and without interruption within a system that depends on their labor but offers little security in return. It is not a ladder. It is a leash.